A greedy priest accepts a large sum from a millionaire, promising favors in return. Behind the pulpit, his faith is merely a facade for his unrestrained ambition, but during a crowded mass, something terrible happens and exposes his true nature. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing. In the heart of Hope Springs, a small town in rural Virginia, St. Mary's Church stood majestically for over 100 years. Its colorful, stained glass windows filtered the evening light, creating a spectacle of colors that enchanted the faithful arriving for Sunday Mass. Father Thomas, a 50-year-old man with graying hair and perceptive eyes, observed his congregation through the small window of the sacristy. On that specific March afternoon, the air felt different. A tension hung in the environment, almost palpable. The priest adjusted his white cassock when his assistant, the young seminarian Mark, hurriedly entered the room. "Father Thomas, you need to see this," whispered Mark, extending a yellowed folder. "I found these documents while organizing the parish's dead files." The priest carefully took the papers, his eyes quickly scanning the pages yellowed by time. As he read, his serene expression transformed into concern. The documents revealed an elaborate scheme of embezzlement of donations and church resources, involving prominent figures in the community. "Mark, this is very serious," murmured the priest, storing the documents in his personal drawer. "We need to analyze everything carefully. For now, don't mention this discovery to anyone." In the main nave, the solid wood pews were almost all occupied. Among the faithful, the imposing figure of Victor Morgan stood out, the region's biggest businessman and the church's main benefactor. Tall, elegant, with his well-lived 60 years, Victor always occupied the first pew alongside his wife, Helen. Father Thomas began the celebration as he always did, but his mind was divided between the prayers and the disturbing discovery. During the sermon, he spoke about integrity and truth, words that seemed to carry extra weight that afternoon. Truth, my brothers and sisters, is like the light of the sun. No matter how much clouds temporarily cover it, it always finds a way to shine. His voice echoed through the church. In the days that followed, the priest began a discreet investigation. He discovered that the scheme had deep roots, involving members of the parish council and important local businessmen. The substantial donations made to the church were partially diverted through a complex system of fake invoices and shell companies. What disturbed Thomas most wasn't just the astronomical amount diverted over the years, but the betrayal of trust of simple people who donated the little they had, believing they were contributing to social works and maintenance of the temple. A week after the discovery, the priest received an unexpected visit in his office. Bishop Robert, from the diocese, arrived without prior notice, accompanied by 2 members of the parish council. "Father Thomas," began Bishop Robert, his deep voice filling the small room. "Some concerns about your parish administration have reached us." The priest remained calm, realizing the maneuver being orchestrated. "What kind of concerns, Your Excellency?" "There are allegations that you have been showing signs of exhaustion. We believe a period of rest would be appropriate." Thomas looked directly into the bishop's eyes. "With all due respect, Your Excellency, I've never felt more lucid than I do now." "This isn't a request, Father Thomas, it's an order. You will be temporarily removed for a spiritual retreat. Father Michael will assume your duties during your absence." That night, while packing some personal belongings, Father Thomas made 2 copies of the incriminating documents. One he hid in a safe place inside the church itself, behind a loose panel in the confessional. The other he sent through Mark to Victor Morgan with a simple note: "The truth needs a guardian." The next day, when news of Father Thomas's removal spread through the town, a buzz of speculation took over the streets of Hope Springs. Victor Morgan, sitting in his office with the folder of documents in hand, was beginning to realize that his life was about to change drastically. The truth he had just received would be the spark for a transformation that would shake the foundations not only of the church, but of the entire local society. Victor Morgan remained in his office until late at night, the documents sent by Father Thomas spread out on his mahogany desk. The lamplight cast restless shadows on the walls as his eyes scanned each page with growing indignation. As an experienced businessman, it didn't take long for him to understand the complexity of the scheme he held in his hands. Helen needs to see this, he murmured to himself, thinking of his wife who, besides being a life partner, was a respected retired financial auditor. The next morning, the couple met in the library of their mansion, an elegant room with floor-to-ceiling shelves. Helen adjusted her reading glasses and began to methodically analyze the documents, while Victor paced back and forth, restless. "Victor, this is much more serious than we imagined," Helen declared after a few hours of analysis. "These receipts show a pattern of embezzlement that goes back at least 5 years. The signatures, the shell companies, everything very well orchestrated. What intrigues me most is the timing of Father Thomas's removal," replied Victor, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It can't be a coincidence." The couple was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Martha, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 2 decades. "Mr. Victor, Mrs. Helen, excuse me for interrupting, but I thought you'd like to know there's a commotion at the church. People are gathering there, questioning Father Thomas's removal." Victor and Helen exchanged significant looks. News of the removal had spread like wildfire through Small Hope Springs, generating a wave of indignation among the faithful who adored the priest. "We need to act cautiously," Helen pondered. "If these documents are correct, we're dealing with powerful and influential people." Victor agreed, picking up his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Mike, it's Victor. I need your help on a delicate matter. Yes, it's urgent." Mike Robinson was an old friend of Victor's, an investigative journalist who had retired from mainstream media to run a small independent newspaper. Hours later, he arrived at the Morgans' mansion, bringing with him decades of experience in corruption investigations. "Show me what you've got," Mike asked after initial greetings. His sharp reporter's gaze gleamed as he examined the documents. "This is pure dynamite, Victor, but we need more evidence, stronger connections." Meanwhile, at the church, the newly appointed Father Michael was trying to calm the crowd gathering in the churchyard. He was a younger man than Thomas, with a stern air that contrasted with his predecessor's natural kindness. "My brothers and sisters, please remain calm," his voice echoed through the sound system. "Father Thomas's removal is temporary, just for a necessary spiritual retreat." In the crowd, Mark, the young seminarian, observed everything with apprehension. He knew more than he could reveal, and the weight of this knowledge was eating him up inside. His eyes met those of Mrs. Connie, the church's oldest caretaker, who also seemed to carry her own secrets. Back at the Morgans' mansion, Victor, Helen, and Mike were devising a plan of action. The journalist suggested starting by investigating the shell companies mentioned in the documents. "I have contacts at the registry office and the commercial board," Mike explained. "We can start pulling the thread from there, but we need to be discreet. If those involved realize we're investigating, they might destroy important evidence." Helen, with her auditing experience, began creating a mental map of the financial connections. "Look at this," she pointed to a pattern in the documents. "All the large donations go through a company called Holy Cross Enterprises. We need to investigate who's behind it." As the afternoon progressed, more pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Victor discovered that Holy Cross Enterprises had as its majority shareholder a familiar name: Theodore Miller, president of the parish council and one of the most influential men in town. "Theodore always seemed so dedicated to the church," Victor murmured, remembering the numerous times he had seen him leading fundraising campaigns. "Appearances can be deceiving," replied Mike, making notes in his notebook. "But we still need to understand why they decided to remove Father Thomas right now. What else did he discover that isn't in these documents?" The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Victor approached the window, observing the sun setting behind the church tower that stood out in the town's landscape. Somewhere Father Thomas was isolated, unable to tell what he knew, and now Victor realized he was at the center of a much larger plot than he had imagined, with the power to expose a truth that could shake the foundations not only of the church, but of the entire social structure of Hope Springs. The morning began bustling in the newsroom of the Hope Springs Gazette. Mike Robinson, seated at his old editor-in-chief desk, examined a stack of documents freshly arrived from the registry office. His secretary, Mrs. Zoe, a lady in her 60s who knew all the town's secrets, placed a cup of strong coffee on his desk. "You won't believe what I found out, Mr. Mike," she whispered, looking around to make sure they were alone. "My niece works in the diocese secretary's office, and she told me that Father Thomas isn't in any known spiritual retreat. Nobody knows for sure where he was taken." Mike looked up from the documents, his expression becoming more serious. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Zoe?" "Absolutely, and there's more. On the night before his removal, she saw Bishop Robert in a closed meeting with Theodore Miller and other members of the parish council. The discussion was heated. Meanwhile, at the Morgans mansion, Helen was making equally disturbing discoveries. Analyzing Holy Cross Enterprises bank records, she identified a suspicious pattern of international transfers. "Victor, look at this," she called when her husband entered the office. "These bank transfers, they coincide with the dates of major public works in the region, and the amounts, they're too significant to be just donations." Victor leaned over the documents, his face showing growing concern. "And the rest of the money? Distributed among several smaller accounts, all belonging to shell companies. But I found something even more interesting." Helen opened a different folder. "Remember that big renovation in the church 2 years ago? The official budget was $2 million, but I found duplicate invoices. In reality, they spent less than half of that." Victor's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Mark the seminarian. "I need to talk to you urgently." "I can't use the phone, it's about the church crypt," Victor replied, arranging a discreet meeting in the central square, away from curious eyes. When he arrived at the location, he found Mark visibly nervous, sitting on a bench under an old oak tree. "Mr. Victor," the young seminarian began, his voice trembling slightly, "on the night before Father Thomas's removal, I saw him going down to the church crypt with a folder of documents. He looked very worried. When he came back, the folder was no longer with him." "The crypt? I thought it had been closed for years." "And it is officially. But there's an alternative entrance known only to some older members of the church. Father Thomas had access to it." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Connie, the caretaker. The elderly lady seemed to have aged years in just a few days. "Mr. Victor, Mark. Forgive the intrusion, but I can't bear to carry this alone anymore," she said, sitting down next to them. "On the morning of Father Thomas's removal, I saw something strange. Theodore Miller and 2 men I had never seen before entered the church, before dawn. They were carrying heavy equipment." Victor felt a shiver run down his spine. "What kind of equipment?" "I couldn't identify it properly, but they looked like construction tools. And I heard noises coming from the direction of the crypt." When Father Michael arrived to replace Father Thomas, the first thing he did was change all the church locks. At the newspaper, Mike was receiving more information through his contacts. Holy Cross Enterprises wasn't just a front company. It was connected to a network of other shell companies, all somehow linked to prominent members of local society. Helen, in turn, discovered something even more alarming. Analyzing the church's old records, she found evidence that the resource diversion scheme had existed for much longer than they imagined, at least 2 decades, and the diverted amounts were astronomical. At night, Victor, Helen, and Mike met, again to share their discoveries. The journalist brought additional disturbing information. "I got access to Theodore Miller's phone records," Mike revealed. "On the night before Father Thomas's removal, he made several calls to a number in Switzerland. And do you know who owns that number? A private bank known for managing accounts of dubious origin." Victor stood up, walking to the window. The church, illuminated in the night, seemed to hold even more secrets than they had imagined. "We need to get into that crypt," he declared, his voice firm. "If Father Thomas hid documents there, they could be the key to unraveling the whole scheme." "But how?" asked Helen. "The locks have been changed, and there will certainly be surveillance." Maybe we don't need to physically enter, Victor replied, an idea beginning to form in his mind. Mrs. Connie mentioned an alternative entrance, and I know someone who can help us map the church's old structure without raising suspicion. What none of them knew was that at that exact moment, other people were also moving in the shadows. In the parish house, Father Michael was holding a tense meeting with Theodore Miller and Bishop Robert. The subject, a specific set of documents that had not yet been found and that could expose the entire scheme once and for all. The week that followed in Hope Springs was marked by growing unrest. Victor's plan to investigate the crypt was beginning to take shape, but it would require meticulous preparation. For this, he sought out George Peterson, a retired architect who had participated in the last major restoration of the church 30 years ago. The original plans of the church are fascinating, George explained, spreading yellowed parchments on his studio table. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the aroma of old paper. Look at these underground passages. They were built in the 19th century, connecting the crypt to other points in the town. Helen examined the drawings carefully. Why did they build so many passages? At the time, they were used to guard valuable sacred objects during periods of political instability, but most were sealed during later renovations. However, there's one entrance that remained accessible, hidden behind the old confessional. Meanwhile, at the newspaper office, Mike was receiving an unexpected visit. Clara Miller, Theodore's daughter, entered his office visibly disturbed. "Mr. Robinson, I know you're investigating my father," she said, sitting down with trembling hands. "I need to tell you something. 3 nights ago I found strange documents in his office. I photographed some before he noticed." Clara showed the photos on her cell phone. They were records of bank transfers and compromising emails exchanged with ecclesiastical authorities. But what caught the most attention was a recent exchange of messages mentioning a cleanup operation in the church crypt. On the same day, Victor received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end of the line was distorted. "Look for the serpent's mark on the 3rd column of the crypt. What you're looking for is there, but be careful, I'm not the only one who knows about this." Helen, immersed in her financial investigation, made another crucial discovery. Analyzing the most recent documents, she found evidence that the scheme was about to enter a new phase. There were plans for a major restructuring of the church, which would include the demolition of historic parts of the building. "It's not just a renovation," she explained, showing the architectural projects found. They were planning to destroy precisely the areas that could contain more evidence. The crypt, the old passages, everything would be concreted over and transformed into a commercial center. And Father Thomas must have discovered this, Victor completed. That's why they removed him so hastily. He wasn't just investigating past diversions. He was about to discover the plans for the future. The entire newsroom stopped when Mike stood up, holding in his hands the first proof of the main story. The headline in bold letters announced, "The Price of Faith, a Century of Secrets and Power in Hope Springs." "It's time," he said, looking at each of those present. "Once we publish, there's no turning back. Lives will be transformed. Reputations will be destroyed. Is everyone ready for this?" The group exchanged determined looks. Clara, thinking of her father, had tears in her eyes, but her voice didn't tremble. "The truth can't wait any longer." Victor picked up his phone. It was time to make one last important call. There was someone who needed to know that the story was about to come to light, someone who had risked everything to start this investigation. The headline of the Hope Springs Gazette exploded in the digital world like a bomb, quickly spreading across all social networks. In a matter of minutes, the newspaper's website was overloaded with access from all over the country. Mike had planned well. Mirror servers ensured that the information remained available, impossible to be contained. At the parish house, Father Michael was surprised by the sound of cars braking abruptly in front of the gate. They were journalists from various television stations, previously alerted by Mike about the scandal. The lights from the spotlights began to illuminate the facade of the century-old church, revealing its imposing nature in a somber and accusing manner. "I need to speak with Theodore immediately," the priest shouted into the phone, but his calls went unanswered. The president of the parish council had completely disappeared from the map since being alerted about the imminent publication. At the Morgans' mansion, Victor, Helen and the rest of the group followed the repercussions in real time. Social media was buzzing with shares of the article, and comments from Hope Springs residents revealed a mixture of shock, indignation, and in some cases, confirmation of long-held suspicions. "Look at this," called Clara, showing her tablet. "The story has already been replicated by the main news portals in the country. It's in the headlines of all the major newspapers." It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. Victor's phone rang. It was an unknown number with an area code from a European country. When he answered, the voice on the other end of the line made his heart race. "Victor, this is Father Thomas." Silence fell over the room as Victor put the phone on speaker. The priest's voice, though tired, maintained the same serenity as always. "I'm seeing the news from here in Italy. You did it, you finally did it. But there's something else you need to know, something I discovered only after I was removed, Father." Thomas then revealed that his forced removal had been, ironically, the key to even deeper discoveries. During his spiritual retreat in a monastery on the outskirts of Rome, he had access to historical archives that connected the Hope Springs scheme to a much larger network of irregular financial operations. "It wasn't just our small church," he explained. "So Hope Springs was a pilot project, a model they planned to replicate in other cities. The documents I found here show plans for a national expansion of the scheme." Helen, who continued analyzing the financial data, began to find the connections Father Thomas mentioned. The international transfers, the real estate investments, everything followed a specific pattern, like an operational manual. Mark, who maintained his position in the church, reported unusual movement. "Bishop Robert just arrived with several men. They're trying to enter the crypt again." "They're desperate," commented Mike. "There must be more documents hidden down there, things we can't even imagine." It was then that Mrs. Connie, who had been unusually quiet, rose from her chair with an expression of sudden realization. "The side chapel," she exclaimed. "I always wondered why that part of the church remained closed for renovations for so long. What if they weren't really renovations?" George quickly consulted the old plans. "My God, she's right. That area of the church has a different structure, with a secret compartment between the walls. It was used in the old days to hide valuable objects in times of religious persecution." Victor realized they were facing another crucial piece of the puzzle. "Father Thomas," he said into the phone, "did you know about this compartment?" "Yes, but I never managed to access it. The key was with Theodore, who always claimed the area was too unstable to be opened. Now I understand why." Father Thomas's revelation triggered a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As the group discussed their next actions, an unexpected figure appeared at the door of the newspaper office. It was Theodore Miller's wife, Barbara, carrying an old folder. "You're not the only ones who kept secrets," she said, her voice trembling, but determined. "For 30 years I've been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment, and now finally, I can tell the whole truth about how this started, and about the real reason why my husband continued with his family's scheme." Barbara Miller sat down in the newspaper's conference room, her hands shaking slightly as she opened the old leather folder. The group gathered around her barely breathed, aware that they were about to discover the final piece of the puzzle that had moved Hope Springs for generations. "It all started with my father-in-law, Augustus Miller," Barbara began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He discovered that the church had been built on land that belonged to his family, taken irregularly at the beginning of the century. Instead of denouncing it, he saw an opportunity." The photos and documents that Barbara presented told a story of ambition and power that spanned decades. Augustus Miller had transformed his discovery into a form of sophisticated blackmail, establishing a system of influence that his son, Theodore, subsequently inherited. But Theodore wasn't like his father, Barbara continued, surprising everyone. He wanted to break away from this legacy, but he discovered something even worse. If the scheme came to light, dozens of families would lose their homes, built on land whose documentation was irregularly tied to the church. On the phone still. On speaker, Father Thomas sighed. So that's why Theodore always resisted any attempt to regularize the church's old documents. Helen, quickly analyzing the papers brought by Barbara, perceived how everything fit together. The scheme turned into a snowball. Each attempt to correct an old problem created new problems, involving more people, more money. At that moment, Mark hurriedly entered the room. "You need to see this. Bishop Robert is making a statement on the church steps." On cell phone and computer screens, everyone watched live as the bishop, surrounded by journalists, announced his voluntary withdrawal and the opening of a complete internal investigation. His expression was a mask of studied remorse, but his words sounded hollow in the face of the evidence already published. "He's trying to get ahead of it," Mike commented. "He knows more revelations are coming." Victor, who had been silent, absorbing all the information, finally spoke. "Barbara, why did you decide to reveal all this now?" "Because I found this," she replied, pulling out a final envelope from the folder. "They're letters from my husband, written over the years but never sent. In them, he details all his internal conflict, his desire to fix things, but also his fear of the consequences. The content of the letters revealed a man tormented by guilt, trapped in a system he himself had helped perpetuate. The last letter, dated just a week before, indicated that Theodore was planning to make a full confession, but feared for his family's safety. It was then that Clara received a message. On her cell phone, it was from her father. "He's at St. Benedict's Monastery in the mountains. He wants to turn himself in, but first he needs to tell us the whole truth in person." The group quickly organized a team to meet Theodore. Meanwhile, in the town, the revelations continued to cause shockwaves. Faithful gathered in front of the church, no longer to pray but to demand transparency and changes. Father Thomas, still on the phone, made a surprising announcement. "I'm coming back to Hope Springs. The Diocese of Rome authorized my return. After analyzing the evidence I found here, I'm going to help in the reconstruction process." In the weeks that followed, Hope Springs underwent a profound transformation. The full investigation revealed that, despite the extent of the scheme, there was a possibility of regularizing the lands without harming the families. Victor and Helen, along with other local businessmen, created a fund to assist in the process. The century-old church, a symbol of so much secrecy and pain, began its own process of renewal. Father Thomas, upon returning, brought with him not only his recognized integrity, but also a transparency project that would become a model for other parishes. Theodore Miller, after his full confession, cooperated with the authorities and dedicated himself to helping regularize the lands and documents. His daughter Clara took the lead in an organization dedicated to promoting transparency and ethics in the administration of religious institutions. On a Sunday morning, 6 months after the first revelations, the church was again packed. Father Thomas, back at his pulpit, looked at the faithful and began his sermon with words that touched deeply in everyone's heart. "True faith does not hide in the shadows, but flourishes in the light of truth. Our church is not made of stones and secrets, but of people and their stories of redemption." Victor, seated next to Helen in the first pew, observed the sunlight streaming through the colored stained glass windows, creating a kaleidoscope of colors on the stone floor. The century-old church remained standing, no longer as a guardian of secrets, but as a witness that truth, however painful it may be, has the power to liberate and transform. In the crypt, now open for guided tours, a discreet plaque told the complete story of that place, no longer as a space of mysteries, but as a memorial to the courage of those who dared to seek the truth. And at the base of the third column, the small serpent's mark remained, no longer as a symbol of secrets, but as a reminder that light always finds a way through darkness.